Secretary for Policy, touching on China and Russia. This event runs an hour. It's hosted by the Brookings Institution.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you so much for joining us here in person in our Falk Auditorium, and those of you who are joining us online or on television. I'm Suzanne Maloney. I'm Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy here at the Brookings Institution. And on behalf of all of my colleagues in foreign policy, and especially in our Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology, I'm delighted to welcome you here today to this very special event on the 2022 National Defense Strategy. We are sincerely honored to be joined by one of the Biden administration's most senior and most thoughtful officials, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Kahl. The 2022 National Defense Strategy was released just last week. The document sets forth the department's strategic priorities and details how it plans to protect and advance vital U.S. national security interests, including defending a stable and open international system around the globe. Consistent with the 2022 National Security Strategy, the NDS identifies the People's Republic of China as America's main strategic competitor and pacing challenge, and identifies Russia as an acute threat. The NDS also outlines how the United States will continue to address heightened risks posed by North Korea, Iran, violent extremist organizations, and emerging challenges such as climate change. In an effort to link strategy and resources, it's notable that this time, for the first time ever, the department released the NDS together with the Nuclear Posture Review and the Missile Defense Review. And by centering Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's concept of integrated deterrence, the NDS reinforces the exigency of effective coordination and utilization of all of the instruments of U.S. national power to address the monumental challenges facing this country. We are deeply grateful to have the opportunity to come together today to discuss how the newly released NDS positions the United States to meet the challenges of what the document describes as this decisive decade, and to address the critical elements of the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review and the 2022 Missile Defense Review. We'll begin our event today with Dr. Colin Kahl in conversation with Brookings Senior Fellow and Director of Research Mike O'Hanlon and with Brookings Fellow Melanie Sisson. A panel discussion featuring Brookings experts, including both Mike and Melanie, as well as Senior Fellow Bob Einhorn and Rubenstein Fellow Amy Nelson, will follow. I'm really delighted to welcome Colin back to Brookings. We've been very fortunate to engage with him over the years on a number of issues around our policy research. Dr. Kahl was sworn in as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy on April 28, 2021. He is responsible for the formulation and coordination of national security policy within the Department of Defense. Prior to rejoining government, Dr. Kahl was most recently the co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation, the inaugural Stephen C. Haase Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and a professor in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University. He previously served as Deputy Assistant to the President and National Security Advisor to the Vice President from 2014 to 2017, advising President Obama and then Vice President Biden on all matters related to U.S. foreign policy and national security affairs. And now, as our session today gets underway, a final reminder that we are on the record and we're also streaming live. So those who are viewing virtually, please send your questions to us via email to events@brookings.edu. or on Twitter using the hashtag National Defense Strategy. For those in the room, we'll reserve the last few moments of each panel for Q&A. Staff with microphones will come around. Now over to you, Mike and Melanie, for the conversation.
Suzanne, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being here, especially Dr. Kahl. It's really a pleasure. I just want to put in a word of personal gratitude and admiration for all you've been doing for the country and all I've learned from you over the years and the opportunity now to collaborate today and hear about the National Defense Strategy. So I thought I'd begin just with a broad question, which is for those who haven't yet read it or for those who have but want to know what's most important to you, what would you say are 2 or 3 of the most important findings or arguments or themes of this review, which just came out last month?
Well, first, thanks, Suzanne, for the kind introduction. Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. It's wonderful to be with all of you, and for those of you online. When you submit your questions, just know that all the microchips that the vaccines have put in my head will also broadcast them in real time. Look, I think the central challenge or premise of the National Defense Strategy is the need to sustain and strengthen deterrence at a time when the geopolitical landscape is fundamentally changing. You have a rapidly rising China, you have a more aggressive Russia, you have persistent threats from Iran, North Korea, and violent extremist groups, but you also have a technological revolution, which is informing all of those trends, and a set of transboundary challenges, climate change, pandemics, and others, which are generating real international security challenges, but also real demands on the Department of Defense. So the National Defense Strategy has to grapple with that landscape. Consistent with the National Security Strategy, it defines the People's Republic of China as our pacing challenge. That term pacing challenge basically just is meant to reflect the reality that the PRC is really the only country with both the intention and increasingly the capability to completely reorder international politics. And to challenge the United States, militarily, but also technologically, economically, diplomatically. And so it's a challenge. And as we think about the activities of the department and the world that we have to be prepared to interact in, not just now, but in the decades ahead, we need to pace to that challenge. That doesn't mean that we're ignoring other challenges. And the most acute challenge at the moment is obviously Russia, which is defined as an acute threat in the document. The National Security Strategy discusses it similarly. That word acute is very intentional because it means both immediate and sharp. Russia simply does not have the capability to remake the international order in the way that China does. It does have the capability to blow up the world, though. And Vladimir Putin has shown himself to be reckless and capable of profound miscalculation and is directly threatening the security order in Europe and beyond through his aggression toward Ukraine. And so the strategy takes the Russian challenge very seriously as well. I would say, there are a lot of core concepts in the document which we can talk about. I think one I would highlight is this concept, and you've written about this as well, Mike, of integrated deterrence and what that means. In some ways, it's a way to remind ourselves that deterrence activities have to be integrated in various ways. So integrated across domains, so not just air, sea, land, but also cyberspace, the informational domain, space, as in outer space. Integrated across theaters, because the challenges we face, especially with other major powers, are global. China is obviously, first and foremost a challenge perhaps in the Indo-Pacific, but they have real interest in Africa and in the Middle East, in Latin America, increasingly in the Arctic. Russia's similarly a global challenge. Integrated across the spectrum of conflict, because we know that the competitors, rivals, and adversaries that we have to contend with are on the one hand challenging us every single day in the gray zone, capable of conventional conflict, but also the shadow, the specter of nuclear conflict also lingers in the background. So we have to deter across that spectrum. But we also need to make sure that we're integrated across the tools of the U.S. government. The U.S. military needs to remain the most potent military in the world, and it will. But we have other potent tools in our toolkit, too, to include U.S. dominance of the global financial system and our unmatched political power. And the other aspect that needs to be integrated are our allies and partners. So the integrated part of integrated deterrence is important. But the last point I will make, and then, and sorry for going on for so long, is to try to actually think of the way in which we deter and the various logics that inform that in meaningful ways. So in a lot of the scenarios that we have to plan against, we have to contend with the possibility of a potent regional actor that engages in a very short, sharp lunge at an ally or partner to kind of create facts on the ground, and essentially dare us to start World War III to roll them back. And so those kind of fait accompli scenarios. So how do you design a strategy around our ability to deny that type of theory of victory to deter it from happening? So strategies of denial matter a lot. Another core concept is resilience. And the reason resilience is important is that our adversaries have gone to school on the American way of war. They understand the American reliance on various networks in cyber, in space, in the informational domain, and they have spent hundreds of billions of dollars to try to hold those networks at risk. And so these are, the attack surface is too wide to defend every point of it, so you have to make sure your networks are resilient so that you can fight through the inevitable disruptions that your adversaries plan for you. So resilience is at the heart of it. And then the last, but not least, of course, is cost imposition, the ability to credibly signal to adversaries that if you threaten the United States or allies or partners, our homeland, we have the ability to make you pay a cost far in excess to the benefits of aggression. And obviously the ultimate backstop of that is our nuclear arsenal, but there are other capabilities, potent conventional capabilities that fit that bill too. So there's a lot more in the document. I suspect some of you have already had a chance to read it, but those are some things I'd highlight.
Thank you. Fantastic first answer. Let me just probe on a couple of the specific ideas. And you spend some time on integrated deterrence, so let me ask you about that and actually pick up on the way it's starting to reach the political debate, where some Republicans are saying this is an excuse by the Biden administration not to adequately fund defense because what you're trying to do is pass the buck to other agencies instead of relying on the armed forces to prevent a war themselves. How do you respond to that critique? How do you think of it? And are there any particular kinds of scenarios besides the gray zone, but any particular scenarios that are really on your mind when you're thinking about integrated deterrence?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's hard to say that the Biden administration is shortchanging the military when we've proposed a $773 billion defense budget. Now, of course, Congress hasn't funded that budget yet, and I hope that that happens soon, because every day we don't fund the budget, we are living off continuing resolutions. And so, and there's a debate on the Hill about whether it needs to be north of $773 billion, and my guess is it probably will end up north of $773 billion, but it's hard to argue we're underinvesting in the military. I'll also say we are making major investments in those military aspects of integrated deterrence. So our nuclear arsenal, which is the ultimate backstop and guarantor of our security, $34 billion for modernizing the triad, and nuclear command and control and communications are in just the FY23 budget as part of our commitment to modernize the triad. There's $11 billion in there for cyber. And a lot of that is on cyber defense, but also building up other cyber capabilities, because it is a domain of competition and potentially of conflict. And the gray zone is alive and well every single day in cyberspace. Almost $28 billion for space.
Right.
And then there's other areas, $7 billion for long-range fires. There's a lot of these theories of resilience and denial and cost imposition. They're in our budget. And one of the reasons why we released the NDS in classified form much earlier this year, and we're grateful to the president for allowing us to do that, even though it kind of got ahead of the public release of the national security strategy, was precisely so that we could link to Congress our strategy and our budget, so people can see our homework. And we can debate about whether we have it calibrated exactly right, and that's completely fair game. But people should at least see that we're trying to be thoughtful about the investments we're making and tying it to the strategy. The only thing I would, as a comeback to this notion that like integrated deterrence is passing the buck, is, in addition to the fact that we are putting ample resources towards our military, is that integrated deterrence is not an argument for our interagency partners doing more or our allies and partners doing more so we can do less. It's an argument that we need to do more and others need to do more alongside us. And as we all do more together, we have to integrate those efforts together. And I would hope that that would be relatively non-controversial.
So applying some of these big ideas to the specifics of China, and specifically even further burrowing down to the Taiwan question, which I assume is one of your most important considerations when you think about China as a potential military adversary. What kind of scenarios are on your mind most when you think about China and Taiwan? Are you worried primarily about an amphibious assault where China tries to seize the island And by the way, if you are worried about that most, are we doing enough to buy things that David Ochmanic and others have recommended, the sort of survivable sensors and anti-ship weapons that can be based in the region without having to depend on aircraft carriers or airfields? So that's the amphibious side. The other one is the one I worry about more, is sort of the blockade contingency, whether it's a tight blockade or a leaky blockade or something in between. Could you explain, in terms of a Taiwan contingency, what do you worry about most, and could you apply any of these concepts or investments to one of those scenarios or the other?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I think part of the reason why the PRC is described as a pacing challenge is because we perceive that this is a challenge that we confront right now, but it's a challenge that's also going to grow and change over time. So, in the near term, I don't, despite the reaction that the PRC had to Speaker Pelosi's visit, which was quite profound reaction, I don't think in the near term that China is planning to invade Taiwan. I think they want to apply coercive pressure on Taiwan. I think they want to establish a new normal around Taiwan. I think they want to put pressure on the international community to acquiesce to China's policy toward Taiwan. I am confident they want to do all of those things. I don't think in the next, couple of years they're likely to invade Taiwan, but you never know. In the next couple of years, I think there could be an incident. I think one of the things we're watching very closely is that the PLA Navy and the PLA Air Force have been, especially the Air Force, have been increasingly engaged in unsafe and unprofessional activities in the air. They come up and say hello when we have surveillance aircraft in the region. They do the same with the Australians, with the Canadians in other cases, and sometimes they do this in quite profoundly dangerous ways. Back at the end of May, for example, there was an Australian reconnaissance aircraft operating in international airspace that a PLA fighter aircraft intercepted, flew right in front of the Australian aircraft and released flares and chaff back into the engine of the Australian aircraft. That could have been a catastrophic outcome. All this is already in the public, whether you've heard about it in the past before. But that's not a one-off. China is increasingly doing that. They're doing it over international airspace. And when you confront them with, why are you doing this over international airspace? They were like, well, you're too close to China. And it's like, well, but it's international airspace. And there's like, you're too close to China. If you don't want these incidents to happen, don't come close to China. And it's indicative, I think, of an effort by the PRC to establish a kind of sphere of influence. So I think in the near term, we have to be mindful that an incident could occur. I think in the period after that, clearly some of the ways in which the PRC reacted to the Speaker Pelosi visit were meant to test drive various maritime, air, and missile activities that might be involved in a blockade of Taiwan, and they bracketed the island in ways. So perhaps that's a scenario. I don't think that Xi Jinping has made a decision to forcefully, force reunification. But he has certainly given his military the charge to have that capability by the end of this decade and probably by 2027. Again, not because a decision has been made to launch an amphibious invasion, but so his military has the capability to execute that were he to make that decision. So I think when you hear that 2027 time frame, that's important to keep in mind. Look, our policy has been consistent. We have a one China policy. We would oppose unilateral change in the status quo by either the mainland or Taiwan. Consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act, we will continue to provide Taiwan with the capabilities to defend itself and also maintain our capabilities to maintain peace across the strait, because a conflict across the strait would have profound consequences for our national interests, but frankly for the world. The economic consequences alone of a war with Taiwan would be cataclysmic for the international community. So we all have a vested interest in that not happening. In terms of our own investments, China has really spent hundreds of billions of dollars to generate anti-access area denial capabilities, the ability to use long-range fires, so missiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, surface to land, anti-ship, but also drones, advanced fighter aircraft, to try to increasingly track and if necessary, target U.S. forces to the first island chain and beyond. So we have to make investments in order to sustain deterrence to show that we can fight inside and through anti-access area denial bubbles, whoever the adversary in that context might be. And we're making a lot of investments. We have to continue to make investments undersea, because I think this is one of those areas, frankly, where American advantage has the opportunity to persist for a long time. And it is a real advantage. We have to think differently about the capabilities of the Marines and the Army. And the Marines have fundamentally remade themselves, kind of coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, to refocus on the types of scenarios that one could envision in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. The Army is also moving towards these multi-domain task forces. And then thinking about how we're postured in the region, so we are not quite as focused on just a handful of places and overweighted in Northeast Asia, and really leveraging changing opinions in Japan, changing opinions in Australia, and new relationships like AUKUS and the Quad and others, to really make sure that we have a more diverse posture and a set of relationships, so that China understands that were they to initiate a conflict, it would be to initiate a conflict with not just one or two countries, but a big chunk of the global economy.
On the same China question, I want to sort of get your gut check on sort of who's ahead right now, if you will, and if that's even a meaningful question. And whether if we had dominance, up to Taiwan and beyond in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, is it realistic to ever get close to that again, or is this just going to be a contested area in military scenarios? And related to that, what do you sense about the Chinese military's take on their own capability and how far they've come? Do they really think that they are either now capable of defeating us, or that they will be soon, or maybe they think that our political will is such that we wouldn't intervene? How do you assess the military balance today and, let's say, 2027, based on what you can see happening on both sides? And then how do you think the Chinese assess that military balance?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, I don't know, what Xi Jinping or his military leadership believes. China has unquestionably engaged in a breathtaking modernization of their military. Where their military is now compared to where it was in the 90s or the aughts or even in the 2010s. And they've made a lot of investments in long-range fires, a lot of investments in advanced aircraft. They've made enormous investments in cyber and space, and they have built their entire military around being able to, come after the United States in a contingency. We have been their pacing challenge for a long time. Right. Is another way to think about it, and they have constructed their military around that. Where does the military balance reside now? The United States remains the most potent military in the world, in the history of the world. And I'm confident that we will sustain that edge. The gap has closed, relative to the 90s or the aughts. But no one should doubt that the United States is the most capable military in the world. And I don't think China doubts that, actually. I think China is quite aware of our capabilities. And so I think, part of Xi Jinping giving his military this kind of mark on the calendar of 2027 is, in fact, recognition that they still have work to do. And our goal is to make sure that, that timeline goes to the right and to the right and to the right and to the right for as long as possible. I'll say one other thing that I think Chinese leaders are grappling with, because we're all grappling with it, which is what are the lessons of Ukraine?
Right.
Because I think one of the lessons for Ukraine is you can look pretty darn good on paper, and it doesn't mean you're going to fight very well. And the reality is that the Russian military on paper looked like the second best military in the world when they invaded Ukraine. They don't look like the second best military in the world in practice. In fact, on any given day, they don't look like the second best military in the world in Ukraine. Right. So I think that, China's not fought a war since 1979. I wouldn't say the war went great for them back then. The world has fundamentally changed. The type of conflict they're contemplating, nobody has really fought. And if you're really thinking about an amphibious invasion scenario, this is literally the hardest thing for any military to do, logistically and in terms of execution. And so, it's one of those things where, like, I'm a football fan. It's like, we all spend all this time in the preseason. You look on, who drafted who and who traded who and who's got the best team on paper, and it never works out that way. right? Like, it turns out you got to play games. And the U.S. military has been at war for a quarter century. And there's an intangible aspect to that. We also have certain aspects of our military culture, the role that non-commissioned officers play, the adaptability of our young officers, the sheer human capital, how we structure, how we train, and and it turns out, again, as we see in Ukraine, these things matter a lot. And so, my suspicion, I don't know, my suspicion is that Xi Jinping probably thinks his military still has a lot of work to do.
My last two questions, then I'll hand off to Melanie. Thank you for these very illuminating and thoughtful responses so far. I'll put them both on the table. And
sure.
One is just to compare the National Defense Strategy of 2022 in the Biden administration and the Austin Pentagon to that of 2018 under Secretary Mattis. There are certainly a lot of parallels, and so maybe one important parallel and one important difference, if you like. And then the second question is this issue of how many conflicts do we need to be ready for at once? You and I have been around through the debates over the decades, and for a long time after the Cold War ended, we tried to have a two MRC, two military regional contingency kind of construct where Desert Storm was sort of the idealized model, but obviously that's not what we're talking about today. So now we realize we probably shouldn't plan on fighting both Russia and China at the same time, but we also can't rule out the possibility of opportunistic aggression by whichever one we're not facing, not to mention Kim Jong-un, not to mention Iranians or terrorists. So how do you think about the question of how many missions do we have to be able to do at once? And to the extent we're not able to do all of them, how else do we deter if and when we're engaged in one major operation? So those are the two questions to ask you to comment on as you wish.
Sure. 2022 and 2018. I mean, here I think, I think a lot of times there can be, a lot of pressure to really drive a big difference between administrations from different parties, and there are a lot of differences, obviously, between our administration and the previous one. But actually, as it relates to the National Defense Strategy, I think the 2022 document is essentially the next natural iteration from the 2018 document. I think the folks who were involved in Secretary Mattis's document deserve a lot of credit for the kind of fundamental philosophical shift. It really represented a change. It was kind of the move into the post 9/11 era, where essentially Sunni jihadist terrorism was our pacing challenge for 20 years, and it led us to make massive investments in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, and to really frame the military enterprise around a combination of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. The 2018 document, I think, recognized that that terrorism remained a significant challenge, but that it probably was now a secondary challenge relative to the reemergence of great power competition and highlighting Russia and China. So a lot of credit to the team for doing that. And in that aspect, there's a through line between the 2018 and 2022 documents. I would point to a couple places where there's some distinction. Even in recognition of kind of the China and Russia challenges, I think the 2022 document, and this is not a critique of the 2018 document, but the 2022 document just tries to differentiate the China and Russia challenges more. Right. We've already talked about pacing versus acute. Those aren't just words. They actually are emblematic of the very different types of challenges and the timeframes around those challenges. It's also, just as it relates to certain capabilities, we are very self-consciously pacing to China in certain areas. So as we make investments in cyber, we make investments in space, we make investments in maritime, long-range fires, aviation, we really are pacing to the China modernization challenge. Now, a lot of those investments would also pay dividends for Russia or North Korea or Iran or others. There are other places where actually Russia, at least in the near term, is driving some of our investments. So undersea, because Russia has a more capable undersea capability, nuclear, even though Beijing is in the midst of this breathtaking nuclear expansion. Obviously, Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and a lower threshold probably for using that arsenal than any other country in the world, also in the land domain. So there are ways in which but we have tried to do more differentiation between Russia and China. The other two places I would just draw a distinction is this notion of resilience, which does appear in the 2018 document, but is actually very front and center in the 2022 document, both because I think we have even more clarity than we did in 2018 that our adversary's theory of victory is to come after our networks. And so making our networks in cyberspace and the informational domains resilient against what we know they are going to try to do to us has to be central, therefore, to our theory of deterrence, if that's their theory of victory. But resilience also matters in the face of other challenges. COVID was a challenge to resilience, and climate change is a massive challenge to resilience. You look at the number of American bases that have been affected by extreme weather events, by flooding. You look at changes in the Arctic, which is not only accelerating geopolitical competition, but putting real pressure on our infrastructure there. You think about how climate change is going to challenge the resilience of whatever posture we build in the Western Pacific to deal with these problems. And you just think about the demand signal it's putting on our own forces. I use one data point. Some of you have heard me use this before. I know my military aides hear me say this almost every day. But 5 years ago, the National Guard in the United States spent 5,000 person days fighting wildfires. Last year it was 175,000 person days fighting wildfires. So the demand signal on our military to respond to climate-induced emergencies at home and abroad is also going up. So I think this is obviously, the Trump administration was, to say the least, not terribly comfortable about talking about climate change. They were very good about putting out Arctic strategies that emphasize the changing environment in the Arctic, but very careful not to ascribe that to human-induced climate change. So I think that's another probably a difference that you see in the document. Oh, you say the opportunistic aggression. I'm sorry, and I'll be very brief. This is something we think about a lot. I think we believe that the strategy is that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. If we were to be engaged in a major contingency anywhere in the world, it would obviously consume a lot of our resources, but we think we would have substantial residual combat credible forces in the other theaters where opportunistic aggression might occur. We also feel like we have certain global strategic capabilities, not the least of which being our nuclear deterrent, but also certain cyberspace and informational capabilities that could be brought to bear to cover down in a second theater. And then the other, asymmetric advantage the United States has is our unrivaled network of allies and partners. And so one of the reasons the document puts so much emphasis on getting our allies and partners more capable, more interoperable, more integrated is also a hedge against precisely a kind of two-war scenario that you talked about.
Excellent. With that, Melanie, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And thank you very much, Dr. Kahl, for being here and giving us the opportunity to really take a good comb through of these important foundational documents. I want to return us to a couple of the key concepts that you've already sort of touched on in the NDS in particular, and return back to the question of integrated deterrence. And the way you described it was that this is, of course, not the United States trying to do less. In fact, it's the United States and the Department of Defense looking to do more. And one of the ways in which it seems to me that integrated deterrence will require more of us is because it's coordinated action across the interagency in particular. And so I'm curious what the status is of the processes and the structures that are really needed for that kind of coordination.
It's a good question. Look, I can tell you how we've been dealing with it inside the department first, because I give Secretary Austin enormous credit for, and this really actually goes back to the crisis surrounding the NEO from Afghanistan, but essentially running a set of what we call policy ops sinks, where the secretary meets with the senior leadership in the building, so the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the vice, the deputy secretary, me, and a handful of other civilian and military leaders, and then has every relevant combatant command on the screen to meet. During the Afghanistan evacuation, it was twice a day. In the lead up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were meeting 2 or 3 times a week, and we've continued to pace on the Russia-Ukraine of meeting a couple of times a week on that issue, in recognition, not that we needed to micromanage things from Washington, but that the information flow needed to be flattened because decisions had to be made very, very rapidly and elevated very rapidly, and leveraging, essentially the ability to have secure video conferencing, secret Zoom, to connect in real time across the entire span of the globe, leveraging the fact that we have, if it's in the Russia-Ukraine context, for example, obviously European Command is in the lead, but there are real day-to-day actions by Transcom that is working on the security assistance piece, by Strategic Command that is in charge of our nuclear deterrent, by Cyber Command, which is doing things every single day to help defend our networks and go on offense against Russian disinformation and other things. Our Special Operations Command and our theater commanders in other parts of the world. So we've been trying to leverage technology and to try to flatten comms in the Defense Department and using this venue. Interagency-wise, I mean, frankly, the interagency process that we have in the Biden administration would be recognizable to the interagency process. Probably people who served at various points in the Trump administration or in the Obama administration or the Bush or Clinton administrations. So I'm not sure that we've evolved our processes very much. Maybe we should. I leave that to smart folks and think tanks to help us think through. I will say I think I'm actually quite proud of how integrated we have been in the context of the Russia-Ukraine context. I think actually, we're kind of at the 1-year anniversary of this crisis starting. You'll recall it was at the end of October and early November where we had really started to firm up the intelligence picture that the Russians intended to do this. We made, I think, the risky but right decision to downgrade a lot of that intelligence to share with not only our allies and partners, but to share with the world and to use it to shape the information environment to try to get out ahead of what Vladimir Putin was doing. And the goal was really twofold. One was to make sure that our allies and partners were on our side so that we could respond rapidly, diplomatically, economically, and militarily, and to backfoot Putin a little bit as he tried to do this. And I think we were certainly successful on the first part. I think we were also successful in putting Putin on his back foot. I just think he miscalculated the will of the international community to actually execute the type of pressure that we've put on him militarily, economically, diplomatically, et cetera. And frankly, I think in some ways he continues to miscalculate that. But I actually think we did have a kind of whole of government response that will be the type of response that we will have to do in a future contingency.
Thanks for that. And I want to ask another sort of conceptual question. I'm really also interested in learning more about this concept of campaigning that you have in the NDS. And so just simply, can you elaborate a bit on what it is and when we'll do it and why we'll do it and a little bit about how we'll do it? Will I recognize campaigning when I see it?
Yes. It means going door to door and knocking on doors. And
Different kind.
Different kind of campaigning. No, so look, campaigning in part is an admonishment to ourselves at the Department of Defense. One thing that concern might not be the right word, but when you put a concept like integrated deterrence on the table, there is, I think, a tendency to think about it in terms of building and investing in capabilities, and then the capabilities kind of speak for themselves. So you kind of build things, you set them on the shelf, and the adversary sees those scary things on the shelf and says, oh, I don't want to do that. That's not actually how it works. There has to be a daily effort to shape the perceptions of our competitors and adversaries so that they wake up every day doubtful that they could achieve their objectives if they engaged in direct aggression against, the American homeland or against our allies and partners. And so to do that, you have to be active. And so what it really involves is a reminder that as we're developing capabilities, what are those capabilities do we choose to reveal, and how do we choose to reveal them to shape the perceptions of our adversaries? That could be a test, it could be an experiment, it could be but also as we're doing things like exercises, right? So we just had this exercise, it's still ongoing, on the Korean Peninsula called Vigilant Storm that involves something like 240 U.S. and South Korean aircraft engaged in almost 2,000 air sorties in a single week to demonstrate how interoperable the United States is with South Korea. We've had multi-carrier exercises where we've done two U.S. carriers alongside a British aircraft carrier and the Japanese equivalent of an aircraft carrier, off the coast of the Philippines, showing how interoperable we would be in a scenario in the Western Pacific. So it's not just doing those exercises; it's also how those exercises are messaged. The information kind of wrapping around it and what you were messaging in the overt and the not so overt ways towards adversaries to shape perceptions. It's things like that. The other part of campaigning, I would say, are in domains like cyberspace, where it's actually the day-to-day contact with competitors and adversaries. So it's one thing to just build cyber tools and they just sit there. It's another thing to actually develop tools and to constantly be in contact with the adversary. So you do something, they react, you see how they react to adjust what you're doing, and you exploit that opportunity, you exploit that access, and it's just a different mentality of action. So that's, so we see it as the way in which you do deterrence on a day-to-day basis, but also the way in which day-to-day you disrupt activities that could threaten our interests and where you compete in the gray zone. So campaigning is really meant to kind of capture that.
Great. So actually, that's exactly what I wanted to ask next, which is how do you think about the relationship between campaigning and the gray zone? And there's some language in the NDS about campaigning coming in response to, acute forms of coercion carried out by a competitor. So is Korea a current example of that kind of acute form of coercion, and campaigning in the gray zone? Is that a reasonable way for me to sort of put those things together?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think, one of the things we've seen a lot in the last year or so is the role of intelligence and information in shining a light on gray zone activities in a way that makes those gray zone activities less effective. So I'll give a couple of examples. In the lead up to the Russian further invasion of Ukraine, we outed a lot of the intelligence suggesting various false flag activities that Russia was planning. In a number of instances, they walked those off, but in other instances, they still did it. But the effect of the false flag was already outed, and therefore their effort to generate an incident and then use that incident to justify something was complicated by the fact that we got out ahead of it in the intelligence and information space. So that's an example of campaigning in the gray zone. I think you've probably seen, more recently, news stories about whether a country like Iran might be planning to attack Saudi Arabia because they believe Saudi is stirring the pot inside of Iran. And the very fact of that information getting out in the public sphere has the possibility of convincing the adversary they can't get away with it. One of the things we've emphasized with our allies and partners is, in this context, is the role of domain awareness in pushing back against gray zone activities. So if countries like the PRC are going to use fishermen and maritime militia and other to do, making it clear that these are not independent fishermen doing things, they're not independent vessels, but are very clearly tied back to a conscious strategy, making sure that our allies and partners understand that and that the world understands that, and shining sunlight on it. So a lot of it is kind of at that intersection of intelligence and information. The other is through the activities to demonstrate your capability to deny the ultimate objective of gray zone activities. So to protect yourself, to defend yourself, and demonstrating those capabilities in a way to cast doubt in the eyes of the adversary that their gray zone tactics will work. So I don't know that it will. It's not going to solve every problem, but a lot of competing in the gray zone is throwing a lot of sand in the gears on the other side, making it harder for them to get away with it and to be effective.
Thanks. So I'm gonna ask one last question, a relatively brief one, and then we'll turn to some audience questions. So for those of you here in the room, start thinking now if you haven't already written down your list of 20 or so questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Kahl. This is a good time to start. Dr. Kahl, the NDS is very specific about where the department will focus on deterring Russian attacks, and it is decidedly non-specific in the similar section about the PRC. Why the difference?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think the PRC challenge is more global than the Russia challenge. I think Russia's capability to engage in large-scale aggression is very focused on the eastern flank of NATO and the other countries in the former Soviet space. But I mean, that said, I'm not sure I would make too much of it, frankly. I think when outlining the 4 NDS priorities, priority 3 is deterring aggression, and if deterrence fails, prevailing in conflict with Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific being our #1 priority, and Russian aggression in Europe being our second priority. And I think the most realistic scenarios for large-scale PRC aggression are in the Western Pacific. It could be something across the Taiwan Strait. It could be something in the South China Sea. It could be something in the East China Sea. So I think there is still a sense that at least the regional conflict scenarios that are most likely to turn into a major contingency are either in Europe when you come to Russia or in the Western Pacific when you're talking about China.
Great. Well, thanks. Thanks for entertaining the questions that Mike and I brought. We would like to turn to the audience. I will say that if the audience doesn't have enough questions, I'm sure Mike and I can find a few more as well. So thanks. We'll start here. I'll start with Amy up here in the front, if we could, please.
Thanks. Hi, Dr. Kahl. Thanks so much for your comments today, sharing your thoughts. A lot of language in the NDS about preventing escalation or deterring escalation from a conventional conflict to a nuclear one, but the language alludes to the fact that we don't yet have an answer to this problem. Is there an answer out there? Similar to Melanie's question, will we know it when we see it? How is the department going to go about managing this problem? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, with my political scientist hat on, right? Deterrence is one of the thorniest questions that international security scholars have wrestled with, for 50, 60 years, because it's essentially trying to prove why something didn't happen and under what circumstances things don't happen, as opposed to showing that, what did happen. So I don't think anybody's cracked the code on this. I think a couple of things. I think obviously we want to deter conflict from happening, period. And then, of course, you want to keep conflict at its, at its lowest possible level of violence, if possible, especially when you're dealing with a major nuclear power where the consequences of escalating from indirect conflict to a direct conflict to a nuclear conflict, suddenly take on kind of existential consequences. I think there's going to be some learning by doing, frankly. I think and I think we should have some confidence that our deterrence can operate. And I'll give you an example. We are not direct party to the conflict in Ukraine. We are obviously helping Ukraine a lot. Russia knows we're helping Ukraine a lot. They also know that President Biden is 100% serious about defending every inch of NATO. And they know both the conventional and other capabilities we could bring to bear to make that commitment real. And deterrence is operated. Despite all that's going on in Ukraine, deterrence as it relates to coming after us, coming after NATO, has operated. And so it is possible. I think that, we were talking about scenarios with the PRC earlier. I think deterrence is also operating there. I think the charge that the NDS gives us is the need to sustain and strengthen that deterrence over time. But I think we will have to think more creatively about how that works, especially when you're dealing with major conventional contingencies that involve a nuclear power. And it's going to get even more complicated because by the end of this decade and into the early 2030s, for the first time in U.S. history, we will be dealing with not one but two, peer nuclear countries as China, quadruples their nuclear arsenal. So we're going to have to continue to work through this problem. And, part of it's going to be remembering lessons we learned from the Cold War. Part of this is, we're out of practice. This is something that we dealt with a lot in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and yet we haven't dealt with it. So there's a little bit of that Christopher Columbus issue, which is just because it appears new to you doesn't mean it's actually new. Like a lot of this stuff exists already, and we need to relearn those lessons. But then we need to identify those areas where things are meaningfully different, and part of it could be that you're not dealing with just one actor, but two. I think the other issue that we have to think through, and that the strategies are very intentional about doing, both the NDS and the Nuclear Posture Review, is thinking about the cross-domain implications of this. Because I think one of the things that very much differentiates current strategic stability equations from the Cold War is the prospect of stumbling into a nuclear war through another domain. From a cyber attack through a massive attack in space, potentially undersea. There are a number of scenarios where the commingling of conventional and nuclear capabilities or command and control or other things and the cross-domain implications of that could lead one party to stumble across a threshold they didn't even know was there. And so I think we're trying to be very intentional about thinking through those scenarios, in part to understand how the adversary might do things to us, but also where we need to be mindful that as we would conduct activities, we want to make sure we're only sending the signals we intend to send, not the signals we don't intend to send in those domains.
Okay. Let's do the gentleman in the middle section here.
Oh, okay. I'm surprised. Carl Polzer, Center on Capital and Social Equity. And the question here, and your answer set up my question. So I was thinking about, as we move, the nuclear standoff's been a two-party game, and now it's moving to a three, maybe four-party game. So how does that change it involves a pre-programmed response that's communicated to the opponent. If you do this, I'll do that. So is there a need to think, gee, do we have to communicate an ancillary response to the third party that can also take over the world and the world economy where the two main combatants have blown each other up? So what kind of reserve do you need for that? And are you guys thinking about stuff like that? I mean, it sounds like you are.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and we are thinking about it deeply. I will say, I'm pretty sure what the answer is not. What the answer is, I think, is still be determined. What I'm pretty sure the answer is not is that if one adversary has 1,000 and the other adversary has 1,500, that means you need 2,501. Right? Like it's not a game where like the person who dies with the most toys wins. Like that's not how this is going to be determined. And the reason I say that is because I worry a little bit that this emerging future of two nuclear peers, that there will be a lot of voices that basically say, well, if Russia has this and China has this, then we need this plus one. It's going to happen. I don't think that's intellectually the right answer. I think intellectually what the right answer is that you have to have enough capacity that is real, reliable, credible, so that if you had a contingency with one country, and this goes really back to Mike's question on opportunistic aggression, you would have enough residual capacity to deter them from engaging in the types of scenarios that could eventually escalate to the nuclear file. So there's very much, that's your residual conventional capacity, but also what your residual nuclear and other strategic capacities are. But then also to make sure that they understand that if they tried to take advantage of something that was going on over here, to raise things to a nuclear level, that you still had the capability to generate unacceptable damage. And the good news on that is we do. I am quite confident that if we were in a major contingency with any country in the world, we would have plenty of residual capacity to defend in the final analysis the survival of the United States through a mix of all of our means. So we have to be vigilant to maintain that capacity, but I'm very confident in our ability to do that now, and we'll continue to have to reassess that as the capabilities of our competitors change.
We'll go right here in the middle front. Thanks.
First of all, thank you for the insight today. And my name is Jay Park from Radio Free Asia. And actually, NDS emphasized cooperation with U.S. allies. So in the situation right now in North Korea and South Korea, there's a tension going on. And also, do you think this given circumstance, general security of military information agreement between Korea and Japan should be normalized, because South Korea and Japan relationship was not good before? So I heard that also there are some difficulty to get accurate information when North Korea launched ICBM recently. So yeah, that's my question.
Well, first, thanks for the question. And you're right that the NDS puts our allies front and center, and obviously, our treaty allies like the ROK and Japan, are central to our strategy and how it's implemented in the Indo-Pacific, alongside other countries like Australia and others. I think one of the things we need to do is get back into a rhythm of making sure that our forces and the ROK's forces are ready and interoperable. There was obviously, after the series of exchanges between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, we significantly dialed back our exercises. I understand why that happened. I think that we need to get back into a normal rhythm of exercising to not only demonstrate our readiness, which is important for deterrence, but just to make sure that we're ready for any contingency. The exercise I alluded to earlier, Vigilant Storm, is an example of that. I think you should expect. Now, we shouldn't be doing things that are gratuitous. The goal is not to increase tensions. The goal is to make sure in no uncertain terms that Pyongyang understands that the U.S. and ROK militaries are extraordinarily capable of operating together. So we'll continue to do that. But really at the heart of your question is what the value of trilateral cooperation is. And obviously there's a long history between South Korea and Japan. I'm sure you've forgotten more about it than I will ever know. It does create political challenges. I think there is considerable scope in the military domain for meaningful trilateral actions. And in fact, after a number of North Korean provocations, you've seen instances in which the three countries have done things together, and instances where the United States has done things bilaterally with the ROK in Japan, but that have been highly coordinated. And I suspect you're going to see more of that in the future. I really do think that for all the meaningful historical and political differences between the ROK and Japan, the threat picture as it relates to the DPRK is very similar. And I think there's considerable scope to do more trilaterally, and we'll lean into that as much as we can.
We have, I think, time for one more question. If we had a question from the young lady in the back there. Thanks.
Hi, I'm a grad student with the University of Maryland. Do you believe that China's Belt and Road Initiative is a direct threat and poses a risk to the U.S., especially with projects in Latin and South America? How can the U.S. counter this initiative?
Yeah, so first of all, is it a direct threat? I think it is an indirect threat, and I'm not trying to be a wise guy. I think that the mere existence of Chinese investments in infrastructure is not inherently threatening. Countries all over the world invest in infrastructure. I think the thing that differentiates, well, there are probably lots of things that differentiate the Belt and Road, but among them is that I think China has a very clear strategy to leverage its Belt and Road Initiative for multiple purposes, and some of them are military. And so a port that could be useful for commerce and trade can also be useful as a power projection vehicle. So, I think we believe that obviously China has, they have a base in Djibouti, for example, but they have interests in building more facilities in Africa, in the Middle East, potentially elsewhere. Other infrastructure. So when they invest in telecommunications infrastructure, for example, what type of access does that give them to sensitive data and the ability to penetrate sensitive networks in the countries that they're operating in? That can be a challenge to the information security of our allies and partners, but also a direct challenge to us. They do certain things, I think, under the scientific and commercial mantle that may or may not be associated with Belt and Road, that it might actually have military applications as well, to include building infrastructure that supports their situational awareness and activities in space. Building a telescope or a communications relay or things like that. So I think what we're obviously not the Department of Infrastructure, we're the Department of Defense, so we're not in charge of pushing back against every Belt and Road Initiative elsewhere. I think we are very mindful, though, in the strategy to be aware of the places where China is trying to make significant inroads in the infrastructural domain that would have dual-use military applications, and then making sure that our allies and partners, the countries involved, actually understand the full implications of what they're getting into, because I think sometimes they don't. This is another example of pushing back in the gray zone, that actually sharing information and intelligence and really communicating what some of the security implications are actually plays a role in backing countries off. I actually give the Trump administration credit for in the Huawei example of doing this with various allies and partners. So we'll continue to do that. The last point I will just make is, and it really goes back to the very beginning, one of the things that makes China the pacing challenge is that they have ambitions. And I do not think we should understate the fact that China wants to dominate the commanding heights of the technologies that will govern the rest of this century. They also want to dominate the underlying infrastructure of those technologies, the underlying supply chains associated with those technologies, and the underlying standards and rules that go along with those technologies. And they want to do it to make the world safe for the CCP. That is, to make the world conducive with the PRC's interests and the ideological preferences of the CCP. I don't actually think that's a secret. And so I think one of the ways in which the China challenge is just different is that those decisions will impact our security, our prosperity, and our way of life in ways that are sometimes direct, but sometimes are circuitous, but no less impactful. So we just have to be vigilant about that.
Well, Dr. Kahl, on behalf of the Brookings audience, Brookings Institution, Mike and myself, thank you very much for joining us today to talk through the National Defense Strategy, as well as a number of other of the excellent questions that the audience raised today. We appreciate your time. We thank you for the work that you do and wish you well. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, Mike.
Really appreciate it. It's awesome.
And for the audience, as Dr. Kahl departs, we'll take a moment for a transition into the next section where we're going to have the opportunity to hear from Bob Einhorn and Amy Nelson, whom Suzanne Maloney introduced earlier, to share some of their thoughts and expertise. So we'll see you in just a few moments. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Nice to meet you in person. I've seen you on screen.
That's right.
Great to see you.
Thanks.